Hey guys, today we're in week 2 of our Men of God series. Now, last week we talked about Jesus and leadership, and this week we're going to talk about Peter, the impetuous Peter, and we're going to be talking about stepping out and going through trials in life. And before we even get into the story today, I want you to think about it in your own life. What trial are you facing right now? Or maybe what trial did you face recently? Or what trial might you anticipate facing, in the near future? Because the reality is we all face trials. Being a follower of Jesus is not a guarantee that we're not going to face trials. Not at all. In fact, if anything, sometimes Christians historically face more trials than non-Christians do. So today's lesson for you men of God, today's lesson is from Peter and what Peter learned when he stepped out in faith in one of his trials in his life. So it's Matthew 14, verse 24. It says, "Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves." They were in a boat. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. Now, the first point I want to make in this story, and you might need to go back and read the fuller context of this, is that Jesus puts his followers into situations that call for courage. Because if you go back a little bit and see why the disciples were even in the boat without Jesus in the first place, it's because Jesus told them to go in the boat and to cross the lake. Now, I would imagine that Jesus knew what was about to happen. I would imagine that Jesus understood that there was going to be a storm. He didn't have an app or anything like that, but Jesus is God, so he probably knew there was going to be a storm, and maybe, just maybe, he intentionally put them in the boat without him there. He kind of stayed behind because he wanted them to learn this lesson, and I want you to think about this in your life. Maybe the situation that you're in, that is a trial or is a struggle, maybe it's with in a relationship, maybe it's in your marriage, maybe it's at work, maybe it's in your community, whatever it is. Or maybe Jesus is calling you to do something and you're afraid to do it, right? Because it intimidates you. Maybe for some of you, it's time for you to go out and start discipling people, but you haven't had the courage to step out in faith. The reality is that Jesus wants to stretch us. Man, I want you to hear this. Just like his disciples in that boat when he sent them off, Jesus wanted to stretch his disciples. He only had a few years with them to teach them all the lessons that he wanted them to learn. And Jesus wants us to learn. Jesus wants to stretch us. And he just might be putting you in a situation right now, or even this trial that you're in right now. He might have that in your life because he wants to teach you how to step out in faith and how to have some courage. Now back to the text in verse 27, it says, "But Jesus spoke to them at once, and he said this, 'Don't be afraid. Take courage.'" And look what he says here. He says, "Take courage. I am here." And the point that I want to draw out here is that true bravery finds its source in Christ, not in man's strength. Men, I think for us, probably more than for women, we have this temptation to think that if we're in a pickle, if we're in a situation that calls for courage and bravery, our first instinct, at least my first instinct, is I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to sort of step it up, and I'm going to show my strength, and I'm going to show my courage, and I'm going to grab the bull by the horns and do everything I can to get this situation resolved. But I love what Jesus says to the disciples. The first thing he says, and again, this is the source of your courage, man, especially if you're a follower of Jesus. He says, the reason you should take courage is because I am here. Don't take courage because you've got a tool in the tool shed. Don't take courage because you're strong in your own strength or in your own willpower. Jesus says, take courage because I am here. And my challenge for you is this: in your struggle, in your trial, whatever that is that you're facing, do you stop first and foremost before you do anything else, before you try to take matters into your own hands? Do you just go to God and say, Jesus, I need you. This is an opportunity for me to depend on you. I need to know that you're here. I need to know that you care about this situation that I'm in, and I need your strength. I think that's what Jesus would want a man of God to do, is to call on him for strength before you do anything else. In verse 28, it says that Peter called to him and said, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." And Jesus said, "Yes, come." So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. Now we're going to get real practical here with this point. I know a lot of you men are pragmatic. You're like, tell me what to do. Give me a practical step here. And I think Peter models it for us, because think about what Peter did here. Before Peter stepped out, Peter said, Jesus, tell me to walk out on the water. And so we can think of that almost like prayer, that Peter actually talked to Jesus before he stepped out in faith. And in your own life, this is a great model, right? Before you step out in faith, before you take that first action, maybe you feel like God is calling you to do something in faith. Before you do any of that, learn to bring it to God in prayer. Talk to God in prayer about it first. Hit your knees and say, I'm going to do this new business venture, or my wife and I, we're going to try to start having kids, or whatever the thing, or I'm going to start discipling somebody. Before you step out in faith, because what could happen is if you step out in faith before you go to God in prayer, then you can get the wrong idea that you're doing it all on your own strength. And besides, maybe God's going to speak to you. Maybe God's going to give you some insights before you step out in faith that are going to be helpful for you when you do finally do it. So be like Peter. And Peter, before he stepped out of the boat, Peter said, Jesus, tell me to step out of the boat, right? He was asking for direction from Jesus before he even acted on it. Back to the passage. In verse 30, it says, but when Peter saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and he began to sink. And he said, save me, Lord. And Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. And then Jesus said, you have so little faith. Why did you doubt me? And maybe you've heard this in sermons before, but to me, the point here is pretty obvious, that the key to our victory is the object of our faith. Where we're focusing is the key. Think about it. Peter was focused on Jesus when he first stepped out and everything was great. But as soon as he shifted his focus to the wind and the waves and the trial and everything, all the chaos that was going on around him, he began to sink. And isn't that so true in our lives, guys? If somehow you can discipline yourself in your trial, in that thing that's calling for great courage, if you can discipline yourself to stay focused on Jesus through it all, and this is maybe where a men's group or a mentor can really come in handy to hold you accountable, right? If you can focus on Jesus all through the trial, all through that thing that is calling you to step out in courage, if you can keep your focus on Jesus rather than focusing on everything that's going wrong around you or all the trials that you're up against or the chaos of the storm, well, then I think you'll be able to stand after all, because Jesus is the one that gives you the strength and the power to step out in faith.